Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and it's time for another Breakfast with Blaha, and today we're having fat-free Greek yogurt, frozen cherries, almond butter. Quick disclaimer, I'm going to ask you guys to stop giving me advice on how to change my breakfast. I'm not interested. Keep it to yourself, please. So, let's come over and talk about one of the things that people do in this industry, and I have clients who do this. It's usually really young clients, right? It's usually really young clients. I define young as under 25, right? Basically children who do this. And you'll notice the bodybuilding world is a lot worse about this than the strength world, but it does happen in the strength world. And it's that people get obsessed with historic figures. And they'll take people from 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 70 years ago, whatever it happens to be. They'll look at their methods in a far, far less competitive world with less science to study and say, they were really onto something. And then they want to latch on as if these people were modern experts. And it's fine to admire a historical figure. But if you were to go to any other field of science, take away from exercise science, and you were to go look at any of the early pioneers of any of that, no one uses their methods anymore. They look at it historically and say, wow, Louis Pasteur was really revolutionary, won, gets Nobel Prizes for learning to pasteurize milk. But no one in 2021 goes and studies his methods and tries to apply it to the modern world, because this stuff has all been studied in far, far, far more detail. Right? I'm just giving one example. Right? We don't use those things in any sort of modern science. There's in exercise science and nutritional science or sciences. They're applied sciences we apply in the real world. And many of these people simply did not have access to data. They didn't have ways to measure all this stuff. It was a lot of trial and error. And they came up with ideas. And hey, maybe they should be recognized for those ideas. But you shouldn't be trying to emulate their methods as if they're going to be the best thing in the modern world. In other words, we have enormous amounts of scientific data studying these things now in a lab where we can actually measure results. We have modern coaches who work with large numbers of people. These pioneers didn't train anyone oftentimes. Or if they did, it was a tiny number of people, and they competed in a very, very small competitive pool to where they just didn't have to be that good. Okay? They didn't have to be that good. I'll give you guys some easy examples. Arnold Schwarzenegger, Mike Menzer, right? Perfect examples from the same era. Right? And you can like these guys and say, hey, what they did was great. Was it? They beat people in an environment where there was no competition. And either one of those guys, by modern standards, they wouldn't hang in, say, the bodybuilding world. How would Arnold be described? If you set aside the fact that he's really famous and we know him for his movies and we all grew up with his movies, you remove that fact and you look at it purely from a muscle and bodybuilding perspective, that guy would be an amateur bodybuilder today who wouldn't win local shows, right? He was an upper body bro with no triceps by modern standards for that particular competitive endeavor. He had no legs. His legs were tiny. Oh, my legs are bigger. My legs are way bigger than his were. My biceps aren't. My pecs aren't. And I'm not even a bodybuilder. I'm a strength athlete. Objectively speaking, my quads, glutes, hamstrings, adductors, everything were way bigger than his, my calves. He was an upper body bro, and it was also pointed out the guy didn't have triceps. Mike Menzer, we could make similar type whatever statements. But people will try to read Arnold's stuff and go, I want to try to emulate him. Really, his training wasn't that good. His training wasn't really that good by what we know today. Again, you use enough drugs and have good genetics and you don't have to compete against anyone super great, it'll work. Menzer, the same thing. He didn't beat anybody. There was no one there. bodybuilding barely existed. His methods have been largely debunked, and he only trained a tiny number of people to work with. We have modern coaches who work with hundreds of athletes, who have access to all the modern scientific data. The majority of Minzer's theories have been debunked if you look at the modern data that we have. Okay? He did the best that he could in his time. No one was studying this stuff in a lab. He tried to be logical. You can give credit for that. There's nothing wrong with it. But he didn't have access to good data. And he got too dogmatic in his philosophies, right? He would create a premise, and he would assume that premise was automatically true, and it wasn't, and then come to conclusions. Okay, that's called philosophy. That's not science. Same thing. Dorian Yates followed in the footsteps of that, right? Dorian ripped his body apart. You see bigger guys today who aren't ripping their bodies apart the same way. People say, well, his training was revolutionary. Well, not really. His drug stacks were revolutionary. You really go look at what he was doing, he was pushing the boundaries on drugs. And then using training methods that weren't well suited to what he was doing with the drugs. He still got big, he got jacked, he got shredded. He had like 8 major muscle tears. Okay? Something to factor in. Modern data tells us why it happened too. There were problems with the methods. So you really shouldn't be emulating them. We come over the strength. Well, people do the same stuff. What do? They'll look at different people. They'll look at people who were trendy and had cult followings. But who cares? Their methods were maybe okay, but we live in a world today where we have amazing strength and powerlifting coaches and everything else who have coached hundreds of champions. They have enormous amounts of data to pull from. And all those people do what? They look at all the scientific studies on top of it, the modern studies, and try to incorporate it and adjust their training as they go. A lot of these great coaches today were not coaching the same way 20 years ago. They were building champions 20 years ago, but they've updated their methods. Everyone from Louis Simmons to Boris Shako. And then a lot of the other up-and-coming guys. Right? They're all out there. We shouldn't be focused on historic figures. We can respect what they did. You can say, hey, I really like what they did. But when you start trying to apply their philosophies, when today everyone's bigger, stronger, we have more knowledge. We have coaches who are in the trenches coaching hundreds of champions who are using the modern scientific data that we have and applying it and testing it out in the field. Okay? Their methods are going to be a hell of a lot better. That's where we need to focus for looking at how to train and put historical figures in the context of where they are. You can admire their accomplishments. You can make a note of it. Doesn't mean their methods were the best, because they wouldn't be by today's standards. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.